lecture by Professor Peyton Young from Oxford University and Johns Hopkins University. He's going to speak to us today about learning equilibrium with a minimum of rationality. Professor Young is well known internationally as a game theorist for his contributions to evolutionary games, for work in economics tying up with learning of strategies and so on. He's actually a former faculty member from the University of Maryland, and where he taught in the 80s. And then later he joined Johns Hopkins University, and his current appointment is a Professorial Fellow at Nuffield College and research professor at Johns Hopkins University. And Nuffield College is part of Oxford. He was named a Fellow of the Econometric Society in 1995, Fellow of the British Academy in 2007. He's also a Senior Fellow for the Center for Social and Economic Dynamics at the Brookings Institution. He served as President of the Game Theory Society. He has published widely on learning in games, the evolution of social norms and institutions, cooperative game theory, bargaining and negotiation, and distributive justice. His books are well known to us in stochastic control and game theory, and he has interacted with the control and decision community for quite some time, including a plenary talk that I recall very well in 2007 at the IEEE CDC, which is a big town.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. First, I should ask, how much time do I have? A lot of time. I like the open-ended character. Maybe an hour? A little less than that.
An hour is fine.
Okay, so first of all, it's nice to be able to give a talk to people who understand what I'm doing. Economists have a lot of trouble with what I'm doing, so maybe this group will say, well, of course, look at the natural. This is about game theory without rationality. Now, this sounds like a non-starter. I mean, many books in game theory more or less argue that we have to. Well, no, we definitely have no rationality. Many books in game theory assert that rationality is somehow, axiomatic or part of the first page in game theory. That's what game theory is about. It's about the interactions, strategic interactions of rational actors. But I disagree. I say that game theory is about interacting agents, period. It's about interacting agents whose actions affect one another's state, well-being, what have you, so that decisions taken by one agent and then leading to actions taken by that agent have a spillover effect on other agents in the system, and that, what would normally in economics be called an externality, then creates possibly a complex environment of action-reaction. And what we want to study is the dynamics of a system like, any system like that is, in my opinion, a game. And we want to study, under different behavioral assumptions about what the agents are doing and how they respond to information. We want to study the dynamics and what kinds of equilibria the system will tend towards. That's it. That's the program that I have in mind here. Now, any economists who are here will find this odd, to say the least, because of the starting point of not rational agents. But for you sensible people, we're talking about systems where, in the first place, the agents might not be human agents. They might be robots, sensors, routing points. They could be, or they could be some combination of an agent, a human agent, and a routing point. Yeah, so we could we have a range of different number of different applications where human agents may or may not be involved. One of the important things that I want to stress here is that these behavioral rules that I'm going to talk about can be viewed as design elements. So we're not saying, or when you see what I'm going to display as the kind of learning rules that lead to equilibrium, I'm not saying that these rules are empirically valid necessarily as a description of how humans in a dispersed system would have operated, though they might be valid. They definitely could be implemented. They're quite simple. And they could be implemented in the sense of distributed control. And why would we implement them? Well, because in a certain number of applications, we have an idea about what the overall efficiency objective, let me say, might be of a system. But what we don't often understand very well or in detail are precisely these interactions I was talking about. We might not have a closed functional form or even a good physical description of how agent A's action actually does affect B. So one of the things that we're going to get out, so one of the sort of starting points of the analysis will be, can we design rules that are kind of universal in the sense that we don't have to know? I.e., given that there is some not unknown interaction structure and therefore a payoff function lurking in the background, very complicated payoff function, can we design rules that don't need to take account of that? They're going to equilibrate no matter what. That's the idea. This is very, very different from standard game theory now in two senses. First, we ditched rationality. Then we ditched the entire idea that the actors somehow know the game. So we're throwing away both of those assumptions. And I'm going to assert that we still have a really interesting theory. We didn't actually throw away anything that was crucial. Okay, so now, by the way, I don't know how you operate here in terms of, speaking of interactions.
We ask questions on the fly.
On the fly, good, I love it. And I will back them off on the fly too if I think we need to get on with things. But please, don't be shy about asking a question. I think that's the best way to understand what I'm trying to get across.
Can I take the opportunity?
Yeah, right.
I mean,
Now, if this were the University of Chicago, this would be the end of the lecture, of course. That is, the question would start, the attacks would start, and we would never get to slide. But we won't go that far.
It's not meant to be attacked. I mean, if you drop rationality and you drop kind of knowledge of the game, of the model of the game, what kind of, I suppose you're going to define the notion of equilibrium.
Yeah.
So what kind of, and then I guess convergence maybe to equilibrium, and will we be able to detect which equilibrium or just to some equilibrium?
So as theorists, we know what an equilibrium would be defined if we did know the game, so that's okay. And we can therefore say theoretically that the model will converge to an equilibrium or not. And not only that, I'm going to show you an algorithm that converges to the efficient equilibrium. So that's good. Even though we don't understand the interactive mechanism, we definitely want out, at the end of the day, something that is, say, Pareto optimal. Well, that's what I'm going to show you that. Now, I wanted to deflect a question which very sensibly comes up, especially for people, people with practical minds, like how do we implement this and how long is it going to take? I don't know. I'm going to tell you right now that when we think of efficiency in terms of convergence time, we use it that way, I don't know the answer to that question. That's open. All that we've got at this stage is are algorithms that provably work in some finite time. But estimating the time it takes is a very, in my opinion, fascinating and tricky problem. And so the question will come up. I'm just dealing with it right now. I don't know the answer. You're going to tell me the answer about a year from now when you publish a paper. Okay? Now, really, I mean, this community would be the best suited to actually study this issue. Now, I apologize. Is this readable or only? Sorry, not really readable. We need to.
Full screen.
Yeah, when I tried to do that, we got into big trouble. This is
The view viewer control L.
Control 11. Control L. Oh, brilliant. Okay, here's some terminology. It's still too small, right? So move your chair closer. Yeah? Anybody who finds it too small now has to move. Some terminology first started by Sergio Hart and Andrea Mascalone, the American Economic Review. So there are some economists who are thinking about these things. A learning rule is uncoupled if it doesn't use other players' utility functions as input. Okay, that's a very good starting point. Dean Foster and I one-upped them and said, well, no, let's go even further. Let's consider learning rules that doesn't even use the other person's actions as input. So I can't see what they're doing. Suppose that's the case. I don't know what their payoffs are. I don't even know really what they're doing.
So what's the information about?
The information will be your own payoffs.
Only.
Only your own payoffs. You'll see this in a minute. So that's going to be the trick here. That's called a completely uncoupled model. Of course, it is coupled. Right? This is a slightly misleading term, especially for control theory, I think, because, of course, in the end, there is a coupling that's going on in the background, but that's the terminology.
So will it reduce to the single player game? So you only depend, you will choose your actions depends only on your payoffs.
Yes. So actually, raise the question again in about 4 or 5 slides, because this is a good question. I want to come back to it. So a Bayesian learning is uncoupled, but not completely uncoupled in the way it's usually set up, right? In a Bayesian model, what we do is we look at the state of the world, and the state of the world typically involves what the other agents are doing, and we update, okay? So that won't work, but reinforcement learning is more like what I have in mind. Now, we know that classical reinforcement learning, all the Bush, Mosteller, Bernstein, and so forth, actually does not equilibrate games. This has been known since the 1950s. So, in fact, this whole line of work actually sort of was a burst of activity in the 1950s, and then it died out because people couldn't get it to work. They couldn't get reinforcement learning to line up in any sense with the usual notions of equilibrium, even in really simple games, by the way. This doesn't work. And so we're trying to revive this idea and show that it can be made work. Now, why would we be interested in these systems? Well, an example that I think sort of is a nice, at the intersection of economics and engineering is the first one. I mean, the city traffic models. Now, these involve human agents. Actually, it's quite deeply studied how people do respond to, say, congestion and such. We know a fair amount about that. The rules that I'm going to tell you about actually apply to that case very nicely, and I'll show you that toward the end. They could be applied in principle to all kinds of distributed problems where the agents are not really human agents, they're design components, say robots or something like that. So here's the bottom line of the paper. I'm going to show you that there are simple, completely uncoupled rules such that they approximate Nash equilibrium behavior in any generic, that's sort of a unimportant, finite game that has at least one pure Nash. Now, so there is a restriction here, namely, I need this model to have at least one pure Nash equilibrium, i.e., not all of the equilibria should be mixed, okay? I think in almost all engineering applications I'm aware of, this is a reasonable assumption. It's certainly a reasonable assumption in traffic models and, say, coordination problems, things like that, consensus, all of that sort of stuff. These have pure equilibrium. Actually, however, we can extend the theory even to games with mixed equilibria. It just gets a little fancier, and I'm not going to deal with that here. So, in fact, if you're worried about this, there's a variant of the algorithm that works even if they're only mixed equilibrium. But I don't have the time or the inclination right now to get into that sort of it's really an extension of this model. Now, what is surprising is that you can actually design these completely decentralized rules in order to get an efficient equilibrium out the back end. By efficient will mean sum of utilities is maximized, subject to being in equilibrium. That's good. So it's not going to select inferior equilibria. That's a really big deal. I already mentioned this. There's a variant that works with sampling and mixed equilibria. Okay, so let's go now to the notational framework, which is standard in game theory. We have a finite, possibly very large set of players. N here, we could be thinking of 1,000 easily, maybe 1 million. Each of these players has an action space. I will assume here that the action spaces are finite. They're discretized, but they could be very big. And then there are utility functions that map the joint action space to the real numbers, and that is what makes this a game. Once I write down any system like that, I've got a game. Because the key here is that each UI is dependent upon product AI. Once we specify that, then we've got a game. We don't have to talk about rationality at all. Okay, now...
Is that your answer to this question?
No. I'm coming, I want to expand on my answer to the question earlier in just a minute. Now, the trick of this model will be to endow these agents with certain state variables. Actually, it would be enough for them to have 4 state variables that I'll call moves. Okay? And what will happen, okay, and then they will have, all right, so, and then there'll be a state will be a triple, okay? There'll be a mood. This is I. This player I at a certain time t. T will come into this in a minute. And then at that point in time, AI bar is the payoff that that player in some sense expects, or is used to getting. And then UI bar is, I'm sorry, AI bar is the action the player is used to playing, and UI bar is the payoff the player is used to getting. So that triple, with 4 possible entries in the MI part, is going to constitute player I's state at a given point in time. And so the new or the tricky element here is precisely these MIs. It would be a more standard model if we threw those away. So to answer John's question, I mean, how, this is going to be a version of reinforcement in which what happens is changes in payoff push the player from one move to another. And this is going to do the trick. Let's describe the moods. There are 2 main moods, content and discontent. There are 2 other moods that amount to kind of transitional moods that are less important. Content players play their benchmark action, say a bar, with a high probability, and they experiment with a low probability. Epsilon will be a parameter that we tickle. Sort of depending. We make it small, whatever small means in a given context. And when they experiment, they get a payoff UI prime. So I'm up, yes? I'm used to getting UI bar. Okay? I try something new. I get a payoff, a realized payoff, UI prime. If UI prime is at least as good as UI bar, then I accept that new action that led to the higher payoff with a probability that looks like this. Actually, this is basically just a logit type model, sort of in hidden form. And this will assume here that this G function is, doing the right, it's monotone in the size of it's monotone in the right way. And linear here, it doesn't matter. Linearity is completely unimportant, by the way. But let's just say it's a monotone linear function. And the bigger the payoff is, the bigger the payoff gain, of course, the more likely I have to accept it. That's all of this is. Okay. Why did I choose this functional form? Well, so that I can conduct the proofs in an easy way and keep track. There's a lot to keep track of here when you're doing proofs. At the end of the day, you can assume much more general. Now, you had a question.
Yeah, before I guess lose, the AI bar, is it some kind of average? Or?
No, that's good. It is not an average. It is a current fallback action that you're planning to take unless something happens. By happening, we'll see in a slide or two in a minute what I mean by happening.
Is it fixed?
It's fixed for a while. There's some inertia. You don't keep re-averaging. You do not keep re-averaging to get AI bar. AI bar is fixed for a while, then there'll be some transition, yes? Here's an example of the transition, yes? I experiment, I get a higher payoff than the usual one. With my new action, I accept the new action, meaning that becomes my new benchmark with this probability. So then the benchmark will shift.
And how do we choose it at time 0?
Oh, just set, initialize any way you like. Completely arbitrary initialization.
So is it the AI bar is fixed, UI bar is?
All of these things are going to vary over time. When I wrote down the state, that was a snapshot state at a point in time. That's it. They're all going to change around.
No, my question is it once AI bar is fixed, so UI bar is determined, so UI bar is determined by AI bar?
No, because UI bar will be determined by everybody's choice of action, not just your own. Yeah. And that's where we get to the game part. Okay. All right. Now, the other main state is I'm discontent, I'm disoriented, I'm flailing around. What does that mean? I am just going to, every period, choose an action at random. Choose another action at random. Choose an action at random. Yeah? But I'm going to get tired of this, you know, in some sense. And so I'll assume that there's what amounts to a kind of an annealing process going on here, which is that with a certain probability, I'll just stop the search and accept what I've got now. And the reasonable assumption is that the higher the current payoff, the more likely I am to settle down. So notice that these functions are very similar except for one thing. This is dependent on the payoff, absolute level, whereas the previous one was dependent upon the payoff difference. Okay, that's absolutely critical to make this model work. All right, now, so let's.
By you mean all the UI, right?
All the just to give you, I mean, these are not crazy-looking functions. They're perfectly reasonable functions. So here I'm just illustrating kind of what they look like. On the left-hand side is the probability of accepting an experiment with a gain of delta U. And that's rising in the size of delta U, and it's a concave function. Yeah? And similarly, it's a somewhat different, slightly different shape and different intercept, but same idea with the acceptance of a sort of a discontent agent's current trials. So, are these functional forms? As I said, the functional forms themselves are not terribly important. What is, however, for those of you in the know, notice that this is the same epsilon that I had before. Now, I wouldn't actually have to do that either. I could always take epsilon in each of these functions and make it idiosyncratic to the particular agent. But I'm going to need a way to take all of the noise down. So let's just say that there's a uniform overall size of noise parameter, epsilon, and it might be 10 epsilon for agent number 1 and 20 epsilon for agent number 2 and 1,000 epsilon, okay? I mean, I could easily put that in here and nothing's going to change at all. But I do need a simple way of talking about kind of pulling this thing down a bit so with one parameter epsilon. That's going to be the name.
So far you use content in a way that people will use it to exploit.
That is correct. This is an exactly.
And this content in the way people will use explore.
Exploit.
So it's there.
So it's except for yeah.
But you have two more moves.
I had 2 more moves, which I'm going to need to create some needed inertia. But you're absolutely right in the terminology. This terminology, by the way, is not used very much in game theory. But the exploration, exploitation is exactly the dichotomy we're talking about. Now, the intermediate states, let's not dwell on this too much. The intermediate states are a way of saying that an agent is not going to overreact to a change of conditions. What's going to happen is, forget about the slide, just listen to me. What's going to happen is a content agent is going to, try something, okay, and if it's good, it's fine. But somebody who is content and doesn't do anything, here we come to the game part, does not experiment, but sees a payoff change anyway, what are they going to do? Are they going to immediately react? No. They will wait and see if the direction of the payoff change persists. And that's all that these intermediate moves are designed to do. So let's take an example. I'm going to come to the gentleman's question, just answer the question more precisely in just 1 second. So let's say I'm driving to work. I have a standard route. Standard route means that's my AI bar. That's the one I take as a default route. Now, I expect that there's a usual amount of congestion and travel time on that route. Okay, that's my UI bar. Today, coming out here, it was slower than I expected. It was slower than normal. I'm bothered by that, and so I become watchful. I'm not going to do anything right now, but I'm going to become watchful. Is something wrong now? If this persists, then I'm going to become discontent and start searching for new routes. Similarly, suppose that there was less congestion, highly unlikely, less congestion on the way to Maryland today. Should I immediately up my benchmark U bar? No way, that would be stupid. I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait and see if this is for real. But after a time, I'll now jack up my UI bar. That's the effect of that move. So you see that these intermediate states are ways of creating some inertia in deciding whether to go to content, discontent with some new parameters. Seems reasonable. We could make this step, in the model I just use a one-step inertia. You could make it k-steps. You could make it a random number of steps. This doesn't affect anything. Once you see how this works for one step, you'll see it'll work in general. Now, the gentleman who was waiting to have a full answer, okay? So, here's what I'm saying. Everything that I've said could apply to an agent who is sitting in a cubicle and cannot see anything about what's happening. They simply say, punch a button today and get a payoff. They do not know, but it is the case, that there are 1 million other agents in other cubicles punching buttons, and that the realized payoff depends on the joint set of buttons everybody's punching. All of the things that I described are enough information for the agents in the cubicles to operate. They have certain moods. The mood changes are only triggered by things that they get. Something that changes in the payoff they receive. They do not need to observe anything else. And therefore, in particular, they don't even need to know they're in a game, let alone know them. This is still going to work. Does that help clarify what's going on?
So, I have a question / remark. In the context of things like iterative prisoner's dilemma, one uses terms like forgiving, tit for tat, and other strategies, where you don't respond to what you call the defect action by an opponent right away. Instead, you would continue to cooperate for a couple of rounds before you start hitting hard. Is that an analogy between that and watchful? Is that a reason? Is that a relevant analogy?
I mean, it's a relevant analogy in a spiritual sense. That is, you're quite right that this has the same kind of effect, that tit for tat is a very fragile strategy. And if you overreact, everything goes off the, one miscommunication or anything like that, and the whole thing falls apart. That's sort of silly. So, right, this is trying to build in some robustness. Exactly. But I'm not saying that this is going to support tit for tat in the sense that you had it, or hesitant. Other questions? Yes.
So how important is it to wait for at least one period?
I don't actually know if the theorem fails, but I think it does, if you do not have this waiting period. When you see the proof, you realize that this is quite important.
So where does the limited rationality comes, is that limit of information, you implied it as a limited rationality?
Well, I mean, in the strict sense, there's no rationality.
In the technical test, the definition of rationality is nothing.
They're
You
not
don't know
best
the payoff
responding. They're
matrix.
not best responding to, in the economist jargon, the rationality means you're best responding to a model of the world. There's none of that. I mean, maybe you could invent some sort of model of the world that supports this as a Bayesian rule, but I don't think that would be very interesting.
But you follow your pre-defined rule, right?
Sorry?
All the players follow the.
Okay, all the
predefined
players
rule.
are following a rule in this class. For the moment, I'm making it a uniform rule. Actually, it turns out that isn't needed either. But we are going to need them to follow a rule in this class. If we have time, I'll get to that point later. Okay, we can have heterogeneity.
Can I ask a small question, perhaps? I'm just trying to think of connection of these notions to the reflective games. And is there a kind of link that the underlying dynamics, which even though are neglected locally, somehow govern the process towards a stable equilibrium? Because dynamics induce some kind of repetition of the process. And this eventually enforces stabilization of even possibly unstable equilibrium. Is there any link in that direction?
I mean, there may be. I don't know specifically. All I know is here's a rule, and there's a proof, which this rule actually does equilibrate with high probability. Well, we need to get to the sense in which it equilibrates, though. That's already a tricky concept. So, can everybody hear me, by the way?
There must be some assumption of the following type, the way it's operates, that somehow over time, all the agents influence the global pair the global equilibrium.
Yeah, exactly.
So if
So,
somebody gets disconnected. they're gonna
no,
go.
you're absolutely right. And so the question is when I'm going to sort of, I'm going to skip these flow diagrams. Here, you actually anticipated the slide I wanted to get to next. So here's qualitatively how this thing is going to work. So we're now going to think about not the individual agent, but the whole system. Now, individual agents will only experiment from time to time, all right? When they do experiment, let's just say, for the sake of argument, everybody's content at the moment. So the only things that are going on are just occasional experiments. I try something, if it's good, up we go, yes? So that's just hill climbing. That's just, standard exploitation type model, and it'll go on agent by agent. But the hitch is that because this is a game, what's good for me may be bad for you. So what I did in my hill climbing may be to get a better payoff, but it caused your payoff to go down. Now what? Well, if that persists, you're going to become discontent. Now comes the good part. Your discontent behavior will cause other people to become discontent. The point is that when one agent flips into a discontent mode, you up the probability that other agents will become discontent. And so what you get in this, viewed as a sort of global system, the noise goes through phase shifts. There's some periods where you've got sort of gentle hill climbing, and everybody's going up or staying level. And then something goes wrong, and there's a sort of a contagion of noise throughout the system, and it's that is going to cause fast search. Then eventually the fast search will die away. That's the sort of built-in annealing that we've got here. Then we'll start the hill climbing again. The beauty of the thing is that no agent needs to know any of this. It's going to work automatically. So now that you see how it works, we're done, right? I mean, now you can believe that the result, there could be a result.
How long it takes?
How long?
Because it may take forever.
No, it doesn't take forever. But the nature of the proof, which, and I'll just have to refer you, we're not going to do proofs here, right? Where this, nobody wants to see this proof. It's really involved. Yeah.
Are you assuming that the game here is not competitive? Because you were saying that.
Any kind of game. This is going to work for example. This is where this work differs from a lot in the literature, like say potential games.
Just to make sure that I understand what you're saying, you were saying that the fact that you're at this point and
Might.
it's a problem of mind.
Might. So if there are some elements of competition, right, but I'm saying this is a general game, and in this sense, this is very different from what typically you see in the control literature, which is, oh, let's assume this is a potential game or a consensus game or something. No. This is any game. We don't assume any structure on the game at all.
So suppose some user just don't care about the utility and payoff. He just random choose any strategy. What happens?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, in a sense, we're going to make them care. That is, we're going to design them so they care. This is a description of their update, and we built them this way. Oh, let's see. Let me fast forward a little bit. Okay, we need a couple of technical definitions, and then I'll actually state the theorem, and then what I'm going to do is wave my hands and show you sort of how things go.
So we look at, okay, you should skip the slide that I would like to see that says called interdependence.
Yeah, we're going to come to that. Interdependence is,
Okay, if you come to this.
we will come to it. So, state of the system. Well, I've got n agents, possibly n big, and so each one of these is just a vector representing a list of the moods of the agents, a list of benchmark actions of the agents, and so forth. So it's just the state of the whole system at a given point in time, and I've just omitted the t time variable for convenience. And now, the welfare of a given state we can talk about as just the sum of the u1s. Okay, so remember that this is a game, so that number depends on everybody's action. Okay, so those are the actions that sort of the fallback position actions that everybody will take. Those are the utilities, and the sum of all of those utilities is the, quote, welfare of the state. Now, economists go berserk at this stage because they say, well, that's not meaningful. Welfare is you can't just add up utilities because then you're making interpersonal comparisons. Well, I just did. Yeah, we're making interpersonal comparisons. For those of you who, I don't think control theorists are that worried about this. Let's defer that to pure question time. This is not a crazy assumption at all. It's what falls out of the model. Yes, we are in fact going to have a notion of additive welfare.
Or do you just do it? You can do it for other, you know.
Do it.
Do it for other forms.
And we can do it for other forms. The way I've set this up, this is in fact going to be additive. Yeah.
But you could do
If I didn't have, if I changed those response functions and acceptance functions to have a nonlinear term in the exponent, then I would have something different. Okay. Now, some terms, these are standard terms in game theory. What is a delta equilibrium? Well, it means that it's a state, a set of actions, A bar, such that a deviation doesn't gain me more than delta. Okay, in other words, we're thinking of delta as being a smallish number. It's pretty close to being an equilibrium. If delta is 0, then it's an action. So this is a standard idea, often called an epsilon equilibrium in game theory, but I've used epsilon to mean something else here. So let's call it a delta equilibrium. Now then, we can similarly, this is not so standard, talk about the degree of instability of a state. Well, it's the minimum delta such that A bar is a delta equilibrium. That seems reasonable. Yeah? Some states are more unstable than others. They're more easily destabilized if somebody can get a great big gain from deviating. Okay? So the biggest gain is the sort of delta that we're measuring here. And we can sort of measure the overall instability of a point by saying, well, how big is delta?
So the definition of delta equilibrium is very much like what we did with the Trump-Layton hand.
Yes. Now, Now, John wants to see interdependence. Actually, I mean, interdependence is important, but let's not exaggerate its importance. What it says is that the game doesn't split entirely into sort of sub-components that aren't related to one another. That's a pretty weak assumption. I mean, what we're saying is that there really is coherence, some coherence between all parts of the system. And the way we set that up is we say, well, if I start with a vector A, and I start with a subset of players J, and I look at some I that's not in J, then there is some set of actions that that set J can choose. That will change them over time. Okay, now let's look at where that would be traffic models. Wait a minute, let's stop for a minute. A game is generic if there are no payoff ties, i.e. if I'm drawing the numbers that are the payoffs sort of as in a random number generator. Then the probability is 1 that the payoffs will be no payoff ties exactly, and then this condition automatically holds. Well, why? Because this is different from that, and therefore the payoffs must be true. Okay, so this immediately, but this is a much weaker condition than genericity. Take a traffic model. Okay, actually there are lots of different changes of strategy that will lead to identical payoffs for some people. If I change my driving pattern on a certain route to here, that doesn't affect what somebody in Virginia pay off for somebody in Virginia's case. Okay, so there is some sort of lack of influence from here to there, distance. But this is still interdependent.
What is the interdependence with respect to time?
This will merely be, okay.
That was the same subset to that way?
No, just any subset that is a proper subset at any time.
So you want to weaken it over a finite period of time, there are some things for that discussion.
Okay,
Because you actually, if you write this down, it's going to be a distributed algorithm, so if you've got a sort of skyfly kind of, very high level notion of convergence, it needs to establish that the agents directly or indirectly communicate over a finite period of time frequently enough. That's what I'm getting.
and you could weaken it in that way. You could weaken it in some way like that, so to have some sort of time dependence.
Right.
Let's not do that here,
Okay.
but the point is correct. Tell me why a traffic game satisfies interdependence, even though the payoffs are non-generic. Take any group of agents, take another agent not in the group, we can affect their payoffs, we'll all go drive on the same road that they're on. That's all. The point is that's truthfully, every agent can influence the payoff of another agent. It's a very weak assumption, actually. It really says the game doesn't break into sort of distinct components. Okay. Here's the theorem. A finite, but possibly huge, interdependent n-person game. I call this trial and error learning with these acceptance functions f and g. So, every stochastically stable equilibrium state maximizes welfare among all pure Nash equilibriums. Remember we had this definition of welfare. Some of the utilities. If it doesn't, now this is sort of a dividend that my co-author Barry Podolsky and I were very, very happy to get actually, and we hadn't expected, that actually the theory tells you what happens when there isn't a pure Nash equilibrium state as well. You get a very clean formula saying how welfare and stability are traded off. Okay, and that's in the second statement. Suppose there are no pure equilibrium states, by which I mean a pure Nash equilibrium. Okay, suppose that they don't exist. Then the long-run stable states maximize this function here. And this function, remember here, the w is a linear function of some of the u's. And this function here is a maximum sort of deviation. That's a maximum payoff gain that would result from something.
What's stochastic and stable?
Okay, so I haven't defined stochastic stability. I guess some people here, many people don't know what it is. What we have here is a huge Markov chain.
In what probability space?
In a giant space.
In what probability space?
It's actually, we have a chain with the states are these states that I talked about.
But I do not know anything, so how I can start the probability space?
Oh, no, I don't have to, I'm just, the probability transition matrix is determined by these mood-based rules.
But so far you haven't introduced it.
No, I can, from every state,
Yeah.
I can write down now the transition probability to every other state next period.
In what probability space?
It's just probability, it's nothing.
No. I'll give you a hint why I'm asking.
Okay, why are you asking?
It comes from your own colleague, Samson Abramsky. Computer science.
All right, so I'm not sure that this is, in my way of thinking about this, we don't have to do this in any fancy probability space. This simply is a giant probability transition matrix. That's it.
But
And it's time homogeneous.
fine. But I would challenge you all the time that how you construct probability space and why probabilities mean anything. You cannot just assume them in the setup you have. That's why I'm trying to challenge you.
Okay, all right, okay. I think this could take us down.
In other words, I'm driving on the street. Okay?
Yeah.
My statistics and yours are not the same. And they never can be commensurable unless we can't communicate.
Okay, okay, all right. Well, fine, now I understand where you're coming from. So,
Yeah.
I'm assuming that there's no noisiness of that kind. There's no, if we could, but that would add an additional layer of complexity here. We could have an additional sort of fuzziness or noisiness, yes, in the, say, payoff realizations and in the statistics.
But even in the way you produce statistics, I claim that anyway.
All right, I think maybe.
This is my controversial question.
Okay,
so
this
it's
is your
your
controversial question, which I think I've avoided by the way I set things up, but maybe we can listen to it. Okay, now what is a stochastically stable equilibrium?
Right.
We have a chain, we have a Markov chain. That chain has an ergodic distribution. The way I set this up is such that actually it has a unique distribution. So it's independent of the starting state. Okay, so that's point number one. Remember, these are time homogeneous transitions. Okay? Now, that's for a given value of epsilon. What I do is I study the shape of that ergodic distribution as epsilon becomes small. It's not that I take it small a la annealing over time. I don't say take epsilon as a function of time and ramp it down at a particular rate, although I could do that. I'm talking about fix an epsilon, look at the ergodic distribution. Now take another epsilon, look at the ergodic distribution there. As you take epsilon smaller, what happens here is that you get pileup on, well, usually actually just one state. That's the way these things typically work. Unless they're ties, typically there's going to be a unique state. And that's what we're selecting. That's what's called a stochastically stable state. The one where when the epsilon is small enough, you get very high concentration on the stochastically stable state. Now, what does this mean concretely from a physical point of view? Well, it means that that state, when the noise is small, is the one that the process is in much more often than any other state. And that's what we're saying is going to happen and that we're characterizing those states here. We're saying those states are Nash equilibrium states that maximize volume. Now, how long does it take to get there? You're going to write the paper on that. That's tired of this, yes? You write the paper showing either that it's hopeless, that it takes too long, or, in my opinion, if you do this right, you're going to show the following. It doesn't take that long when epsilon is of an intermediate or sort of fairly small but not too small. I already have a paper on this, so I'm one step ahead. But it isn't about traffic games. The idea will be, for those of you who seriously want to pursue this, of course, if epsilon is taken smaller and smaller and smaller, by definition, it's going to take longer and longer and longer to realize the ergodic distribution. Yes, the mixing time just gets long, that's all. But what turns out to be the case in a lot of these games is that if you take a, quote, fairly small epsilon, where that needs to be defined with a then you get pretty fast convergence to a kind of a noisy Nash, which I say is good enough. Well, it's good enough.
When you say small but not too small,
It's a meaningless statement.
right. But how would that depend on the functions that you define? Because it seems like it depends on how many guys are interacting with you and so on and so forth.
Okay. It should. You would think it does. But there's some amazing results you can get which show an extent to which certain bands of noise level actually are fairly, the results are fairly insensitive to what the utility functions are. This is completely non-intuitive that this should be true. I just can't pursue it here. Yes, this is a completely different paper. It would take 2 hours to explain that paper. That other paper is a first step that can be found on my website. It's called Fast Convergence in Evolutionary Models of Equilibrium Selection. It doesn't do the full Monty because it's only for small games, but it shows you how this can work and why you can get results that are pretty robust against the payload. I mean, in a 2x2 game, suppose I have a noise level at the individual. This is a very simple case, but you have to start somewhere. Suppose that you have trumbles at the individual level. They're just 2 players, and that the individual trumbles are, say, on the order of about 10%. Meaning, I choose the best response, which is 1 for 90% probability. I choose the other with 10% probability, roughly speaking. Then, pretty much irrespective of the payoffs, this thing converges. That's a remarkable thing that is very unintuitive. Okay, I'm getting. I think everybody here is reasonably clear why this is related to log linear learning. Is that pretty obvious? Yeah. It's basic. How do you prove these things? You can ask me later. I want to jump to this. I mean, in your field, potential functions play a big role. So what does this have to do actually with potential functions? Let's look at that first. Now, it's very well known that if you have a potential function, meaning a function from the product space A to real numbers, such that changes in potential equal changes in utility when a single agent deviates. That's the definition of potential. Now, let's suppose agents use log linear learning. Okay, so each period, say an agent is chosen at random, updates using log linear learning. Now, here we'll not be assuming this reinforcement learning rule that I talked about earlier. Here, let us assume that the agents can indeed observe what the other agents are doing and choose the best response. Okay? So now, this is the standard model. In that standard model, with the potential game, and this kind of one-at-a-time asynchronous update, you can show that the long-run distribution and the stochastically stable states are those that maximize potential. They maximize the potential. Yes? But they do not. The potential of games like this is not the same as maximizing the welfare. And that's a really important point. In fact, traffic models are a really nice illustration of this. Let's suppose we've got a network, say routes to work and so forth, and there are n agents that sort of drive over these routes. And so we have some congestion function, say Cj of nj. The more people nj that are using route j, then the higher the individual congestion cost, right? The time, whatever. Okay, now you can show that a potential function for this game is the negative of the sum of those numbers. But there's a problem. These are the individual numbers. But the welfare of the system is this. It's nj c nj. Because you've got to look at the total congestion summed over all people. But that's not a potential function for the system. That's the welfare function. So my model, whereas many models in the literature indeed can get you something that either locally or globally maximizes this, my method gets you something that maximizes what you really want to have, which is kind of overall system. It's more like system optimization. Okay, so that's a big difference between, you know, for example, Shaw and Shin and what I'm doing, and some other people working in the same line in the distributed control. Somebody asked about heterogeneity. Well, I can make, frankly, I can make, as long as these functions are monotone, I can take, as long as you give me an f function and a g function that are functions respectively of payoff level and payoff difference in a monotone fashion, and this condition actually says that the acceptance probabilities are reasonably high, that's what it really says, then we're good. You can define a sort of analogous theorem using this sort of transformed, these transformed welfare and stability functions. Yes. You'll still get Pareto optimality. Now, you want some utilities. You'll get a Pareto undominated, yes, Nash equilibrium. That's what you're looking for. Do I need it? Maybe I'm going a little too fast here. So with these heterogeneous things, what are we going to do now? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is just take each individual utility I, and it's transformed by that fi function. Okay, fine, and then I add up all those. That's how we get welfare. Okay, so that's really simple. And now the stability function will just be, I look at the, first I define the maximum deviation in I's utility terms, and then I transform that by I's g function. It's also monotone. And now I define stability using those transform functions. So that involves taking a maximum over I. This involves taking a sum. It's the same as before. And now I've got full heterogeneity. Okay, so I don't need linearity. I don't need.
But the moment you write that down, right, W minus S, and you say you maximize it, it's again involved that.
Yes, but
So what's the connection? It's a trade-off.
there's a trade-off, but the curious thing is this only happens if there's no equilibrium. So actually this is not a case that in many applications is going to arise. So now this is a confusing point which actually could have been, we could have talked about in the earlier example where there's everybody has the same utility, okay? Same response function. Namely, what the theorem is saying is, I'm over. All right, so let me just go back. We're not quite so confused by these heterogeneous things. Go back to, where's my theorem? Okay. Now look here. So suppose we're at a Nash equilibrium. Then the instability is 0. Yes? So the sort of confusing thing here is, well, then this term is 0. The S is 0 at the equilibrium. Okay. And so we're maximizing just phi of W, but that sort of seems redundant. But it isn't redundant. Here's the issue. It could be that there are some equilibrium states that are worse on this criterion than disequilibrium states. Right? They're unstable, but the degree of their instability is not so high, yes, that it overcome these weights. So therefore, the point is that equilibrium takes precedence here. This will select an equilibrium if there's any equilibrium, and among those equilibria that are possible, it will select the maximum welfare. If there are no equilibria, then the second formula applies. But the second formula does not apply in general. This is a slightly tricky point. And of course, for games where we have pure equilibria, traffic games, consensus games, things like that, the second thing is irrelevant.
If you have games where you only have weeks,
Then we need a different version of the algorithm, which, okay, so,
if you can comment on the analog to that.
okay, the analogous result will be I can have an analogous result. Here's how, though, my learning rule will have to proceed. I'm going to have to do sampling. I'm going to have to wait for a period of time to look at a series of payoff realizations before I take any action. That's basically it. So it'll take longer. And in fact, because it's pretty clear why this is, right? I mean, if we've got to play mixed equilibrium, I've got to wait for enough realizations to figure out what my average payoff is. But that's it. That's the main. Okay, so references, I'm done. References, well, first of all, this talk, as done here, is based mainly on the paper with my student Barry Podolsky at Oxford. This is forthcoming in Games and Economic Behavior. An earlier paper by myself in Games sort of showed how to do this without the equilibrium selection part. That is, it just showed here's a way, trial and error learning, that gets you to equilibrium eventually. And in fact, Dean Foster and I did the more complicated sampling version of this algorithm in 2006, but only for 2-person games. And we got tired. And we said, let's let somebody else see if they can extend this to n-person games. It gets really hairy. So what I realized after a lapse was, well, actually, if we have a pure equilibrium, and a lot of real examples are in that. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you.
There will be a roundtable at 3 and 4.
This is using the finite state set. So if I'm given that as fixed actually, that'll be, that'll basically, these systems are almost continuous state systems, right? They've just got a huge number of neighboring states. So roughly speaking, as epsilon is very, there's certain change in the shape of the distribution. It gets more and more, it's like a normal, kind of like a little normal distribution around the stable state. It gets more and more peak with a very low variance.
Based on my paper.
Any other questions?